Welcome to another episode of the Drexel Dragons podcast. My guest today is Karlstrom, and Kira has such an incredible resume, so many things to get into, and we'll list those all in the description, so much to get into. Kira is currently working at Capitol Records, also a 10-year survivor, cancer-free now, of thyroid cancer. Kira, so much to talk about, but first, I just want to thank you for coming on and joining us on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was so much fun. I don't live in Philly anymore. I'm all the way across the country, so it's really nice to still be involved in athletics and meet new faces.
Well, I mean, and I'm excited for this. And you talk a lot about connecting over social media and LinkedIn and the importance of that. But I want to go back to the beginning for you. And before we even get into basketball, I want to start with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., which reads, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." I know that's a quote that's a favorite of yours. You've used that in speeches in the past. I did, yeah. Kind of come prepared for these kinds of things. But I want to ask you, where did you first come across that quote, and what has that meant to you throughout your life?
I want to say the first it's always been a quote, obviously, because, growing up, we celebrated MLK Day, and it was so impactful, and especially in times right now. And MLK Day is actually next Monday, in 3 days. So I think where it really became impactful for me was during my time at ESPN. It was my first job. It was also when I was diagnosed with cancer. And so there's just a lot of things that I was going through in my life. Becoming a professional in the workplace and kind of leaving basketball and my childhood nuances behind. And I think really what it meant to me was, we're all going to face these challenges and these ups and downs and these low points in our life. And these are really the times that make us. And I think we're in a time right now, especially in the middle of a pandemic, is how do we pivot? How do we reinvent ourselves? How do we stay current? How do we transform in a time like this of challenge and controversy? So I think every time that I experience something hard or challenging, that's a quote that kind of comes to mind and helps me continue to evolve and get through things.
Well, and you're no stranger to overcoming challenges. And we'll start at the beginning. For you, basketball, that's how you got connected with Drexel. You didn't start playing until you were 11 years old, had more of a dancer's background coming up, and for you, grew to the stature of 5'3". So, a lot of obstacles. I'm sure there were a lot of people who said it wasn't possible for you to reach the college level or even maybe play at high school. So let's go back to the mindset you had as an 11-year-old. Take me through the daily goals or what the process was for you when you first found the game of basketball, and step by step how you tried to get better and better to the point where you could chase after a dream of playing in college.
So at 11, I was going over to a friend's house. My dad dropped me off, and there were 4 girls outside with the dad of the girl's house that I was at, and they were practicing for a 3-on-3 tournament called the Gus Macker, which was a big thing when I was growing up all over the country. And I just thought it was really fun and cool, and the strategy behind the plays of 3-on-3, and I was really interested in it. And the dad, who happened to be a COIO coach, was like, "You should come play for our 6th grade team." And I was like, cool, let's do it. And I also think that at that time I was going through a challenging time. My parents were getting a divorce. And I think I was also looking for something to kind of bury myself in. And basketball became that. It became this sense of community for me. I made new friends. I was working out and working hard. And it's really where I spent most of my time. There was a lot of times I never really wanted to leave the gym. And part of that was not that my home life was terrible, but going through a divorce as a young kid in a small town at a time where divorce wasn't really that big. A lot of my friends didn't have divorced parents. And so basketball became my outlet, and it was competitive and it was fun, and there was strategy and stuff behind it. And I remember when I got into 7th grade, the women's basketball coach at our high school, Clarkson High School, she was brand new, and she played at Oakland University, which was a D1 school in Michigan at the time. And then she had coached at Auburn University with Joanne P. McCauley, who later became, when I was in high school, the head coach of Michigan State. And when she had came on board, it was a big deal to the school. And we had a lot of history at Clarkson, like Dane Fife, who played at Indiana, who's now at Michigan State, and his dad, who played at Michigan, who was an MLB professional player for the Twins, so there's a lot of rich sports history at Karlstrom, and her becoming part of this program was a huge deal. And so I basically went to a camp, told her I was going to play varsity as a freshman, and she was like, okay, sure. And I remember, I will never forget this. I kind of just hung around the gym. I went to all the practices. I just sat there and I would watch. And one afternoon, she was like, do you want to come home with me and help me do some work around my house? So I went home with her and actually helped her with like wedding invitations and like raking around the house. And she gave me my first Karlstrom basketball sweatshirt. And I was in 7th grade, and I was like, I am going to play for you as a freshman.
Wow.
And so I think it was more the relationships that I built with people who believed in me and the people I met along the way that really kind of enriched my love for basketball. And it was a challenge. I was 5'3". I was not tall. And, Karlstrom was a small town, even though that we did have a rich history in men's sports, but not in women's sports. I was actually the first female to graduate to go Division I in any sport.
Wow.
Yeah. So, it was a struggle, and there was a lot of no's along the way. There was a lot of people who said it was never going to start as a freshman, and I ended up starting the second half of my freshman year and all the way through my senior year. And then, once I had made that step, there was a lot of people who said, no, you'll never play Division I, and then you'll never play pro. And so I think there was a lot of no and motivation for me back at that age. And when I was going through things in my life, basketball became that one thing that I just buried myself in.
Well, and you mentioned that motivation, and I appreciate you opening up as well about your situation with your parents, because actually a student athlete we had on, Paul Macrina, the reason we had him on is he started a podcast called Survive Your Mind. It's about mental health, and he opened up in his first episode about his parents' divorce and how that affected him. But you mentioned a couple things about the adversity, being told at a young age, because of your height, you can't achieve those things, and not listening to that. But where would you say that came from, the ability at 14, 15 years old to not listen to the external noise and instead focus on what you were being told, what you sensed internally?
I think I just knew there was something more in me at the time. I think that it was my one sole focus, and I had always been taught, even from both of my parents at a young age, even though they weren't athletes, that if you set your mind to something, you can do it. And I also think that my dad, before he married my mom, he was a police officer. And when he met my mom and living in Michigan, police officers didn't make a ton of money back then. And to start a family, the automotive industry was really booming in Michigan at the time. So my dad decided to switch careers. And he had told me, I think he regretted that decision for the rest of his life because he loved being a police officer. He talks about it to this day. And it was one of those messages where if you really love something, no matter what anyone tells you, you got to follow your heart and you got to continue to do the things that you love, which I think really helped me in basketball because I loved basketball. I loved when people told me no, that I was going to show up and say yes and prove them wrong. And I think that's really translated to the rest of my career, just even professionally.
Well, and I love that story you use with your father, because there's a Jim Carrey commencement speech at the Maharishi School where he talks about his own father and how he could have been either a great successful saxophone player or comedian, but he instead chose a job as an accountant because he thought it was a safe choice, and then got fired from that job. And for me, that was always an inspiration from Jim Carrey's life of saying, like, that was the reason to pursue what you love. So I love that intersection and that motivation of following your passion. And that takes you to Drexel. So you get a scholarship offer. Were there any other offers at the time? Why was it Drexel that you ended up choosing to go to?
Yeah, I think my first 2 visits were Columbia University and the University of Michigan. But before I started visits, there was a coach, Bill Agronin, and he was at Niagara University at the time. And he had came to a St. Patrick's Day tournament. I was playing in AAU, and I think I was a junior. So it was before we were allowed to be talked to because he gave his card to my dad. And when we could speak, he was heavily in recruiting me, and I ended up going on a visit, and I loved him. I loved the program. But it was a liberal arts school. And the last 2 years of my high school career, I've been really focused on being a graphic designer and going into the arts. And for school, it was really important to me to find a place that had that. So even at Michigan, there wasn't a huge computer graphics design program that I was really interested in. And there was a moment in my career where I called the head coach of Savannah College of Art and Design, which was actually an NAI school at the time. They weren't even in the NCAA. And I contemplated going to a design school and giving up basketball.
Wow.
And Bill had made a call to his former assistant coach, Pam Durkin, who was the assistant coach at Drexel, and said, there's a point guard. I know that you and Coach Crabtree, because that was who recruited me, are looking for a point guard. There's someone in Michigan you need to check out. And so within a week, they had called me, flown me out. I did my visit, and it was really cool. I met with David Miller, and at the time it was College of Media of Arts and Design, and I actually went in and showed them my portfolio on my visit. Wow. And they the design program, I think at the time, was only like 20 or 30 students a year. It was very, very small. And I went to a typography class of John Langdon, and I just fell in love with the school and the art program, and it was something I really wanted to be a part of. And then my other qualification was the school had to be a Nike sponsored school, and Drexel was. So like it hit all three boxes. It was out of Michigan, had a great design program, and it was sponsored by Nike. So that's how I ended up at Drexel. It was kind of like a short, like, hi, visit, are you going to sign?
Right. Well, what I like about your story too is not just from the athletic side, but from the academic and career side, you really had that sense of what you wanted to do going into it from a young age. So before we talk about your playing career at Drexel, I was talking about this with you right before we went on the podcast. At a young age, you loved Disney so much to the point that you wrote a letter to Disney asking if you could do animation for The Lion King. So I got to ask you, one, how old were you when you wrote that letter? And what was the inspiration for that as well? Why did you feel the desire to send a letter at such a young age to them?
Well, I was always an entrepreneur, I think, from a young age. At 7 years old, I bought my first bike, and at 8 years old, I bought a trampoline by selling golf balls on the golf course we lived at, by picking them up after they'd gone over the fence, and then sitting on the fifth hole and selling lemonade and the golf balls back to the golfers. And so I had met a friend, we were in fifth grade, and she loved animation too. We would make our own stop motion, claymation animation with our dad's VHS tape, and we started drawing comic book characters. And I'd always had a love for Little Mermaid, Aladdin, The Lion King, you know, back in the day, these really pinnacle stories for Disney. And I would practice all of drawing the characters on my own. And my mom was a nurse, and she worked at a hospital with a doctor whose daughter worked on The Lion King, drawing Scar and some of the backgrounds. And I was like, Mom, I'm writing her a letter. You've got to give this to Dr. Kazlarian to give to his daughter, because I'm going to work at Disney. And I actually can't remember if it ever actually made it or I got a response. Right. I was hell-bent on working for Disney at a young age.
It's just such a cool story, because I know obviously down the road you ended up working in animation for ESPN and Marvel. I thought that was so cool to bring up. But transitioning into your playing career, so you go to Drexel, and those are the early days for Denise Dillon and her staff. And I had the chance to be a student manager for Denise in my time as an undergrad at Drexel. So what was your experience like then as a player, and what did you learn as a player at Drexel that you still apply to your career and life today?
So I was Denise's first class all the way through. I was a lone senior, and her interim year as head coach was my freshman year. So I think Denise and I went through a lot together, just as a new coach and a freshman. And I think I started with two other freshmen, and I was the only one who actually made it through the 4 years. But I loved playing for Denise, and I think I was a little bit of a hothead back then, and we butted heads sometimes, but in a good way. Now I'm so appreciative to the things that I learned from her, and Amy as well, because I played for Amy 3 out of my 4 years. And I would say, like, if there's two things that I learned, the first thing was my time management, because being a student athlete, but also being in the design program, was not a difficult task. I couldn't take my books on the road. A lot of times I would come home on a Sunday night from being on the road, you know, in Virginia or whatever, and have to go spend the night in the lab because I had a screen printing or an illustration or a computer design project. And so I had to manage my time very well, you know, between wanting to be successful in athletics, but also like knowing that there wasn't going to be a long-term pro career. And I know even though I did go pro, it was never an aspiration of mine. I never really wanted to play pro. It was always about my career afterwards and how I was going to utilize the time that I had at Drexel. But then I would also say the other thing that that I learned was Denise and Amy and the rest of the coaching staff that I had a heavy focus on not only us as players, but us as people. And they spent a lot of time developing us as people and making sure that we were learning the lessons that we needed in the real world. And a lot of that was people skills and relationships and how to manage them and networking. And I learned a lot of that from them. I have a lot of respect just thinking, you know, I'm 36 years old and Denise was 30 or 31 her first year. And I can't imagine what it would have been like at that age to take on such a big program and try to turn it around essentially. So, you know, my time at Drexel, I appreciate it so much more now as an adult than when I did when I walked out the doors. When I walked out the doors, I was like, deuces. But now, you know, it was really an incredible piece of my career and part of the reason I am who I am today.
And you've used the metaphor in the past of being a point guard and how you learn to distribute to different players and how that contributes to your life today, because, you know, life's about knowing where the forward wants to get the ball in the post versus where a guard on the perimeter wants to get the ball to shoot a three. So can you elaborate on that metaphor and what you learned as a point guard through distributing other people, the relationship skills about how everybody as an individual is different?
Yeah, I think, you know, when you're a part of a team, like especially as a point guard, everybody has to know what their role is in order to be successful and how you work together collectively as a group to be successful. And I think the same thing translates into business and to management. You know, I have very different coworkers from all different walks of life with very different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different experience. And not everybody thrives or feeds off the same sort of delivery or interpretation of a conversation. And somebody had told me, Nancy Lieberman, who was a mentor of mine growing up, who's a very close friend of mine now, you know, she had made a comment in a speech about getting to know the players, of how to go up to your post player and ask, like, do you want a lob pass? Do you want a bounce pass? Get to know them, take them out, ask about their family, because you're going to build a relationship. And if you have a relationship off the court, it's going to be better on the court. And, you know, I learned that in postseason when I was working with certain players who hated lifting and I loved it. And some people I would really like push them in terms of like yelling at them in like a fun way. And then other people I would just like be goofy and funny and silly and sing and like just try to get them amped up for being, you know, with Rankin at 6 a.m. in the weight room. So I think from a business standpoint, I do the same thing. I spend a lot of time getting to know the people I work with, what makes them tick, like how they respond to certain conversations, especially, you know, not all my conversations with employees I work with are easy, you know? So I think a lot of that translates just my ability to adapt to different styles of people. And I think that's one of the best things that Denise and Amy and the Drexel coaching staff did, is that they really paid attention to us as people and how to communicate with us that was going to push us to be the best that we could be.
And I know you didn't really have the goal in mind going into school, maybe, of playing professionally, but you're afforded the opportunity to play overseas in Romania. You had a year out there. Unfortunately, though, it came to an end in 2008 for medical reasons. And then in 2009 is your diagnosis with cancer. So I know your story and I could recite it, but there's no point in me doing that. For viewers who are, or listeners who are unfamiliar with that time period in your life, take us through 2008, why your career in Romania came to an end, what you had to experience going through that recovery, and then what happens in 2009.
Yeah, so going to Romania was kind of a fluke thing. I had already been looking for graduate assistance positions. I was going to go to SCAD, get my master's, because apparently I'd always really wanted to go there. And then Gabby Marginian, who was going into her sophomore year, I guess had sent DVDs or a tape, whatever the case may have been back then, to a new forming team, an old general manager that she used to play for, and they were looking for a point guard and a shooting guard. And they saw me on tape and they asked if I'd be willing, and she actually approached me and asked if I would want to go play. So I had already given up I'm not going to play, I'm getting into my career. So it was a very hard decision to turn down going to get my master's and then go play overseas. But, you know, it was a very different experience for me, one that even though it ended poorly for me, I would do it 100 times over. I mean, living in another country, getting to know people who grew up somewhere else and not in your most lavish like area, Cluj-Napoca, They were 17 years out of communism. Some of the
Right.
old generation didn't speak English. It was a harsher culture. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the people there, and I think I learned a lot about myself. But yeah, I got there, I want to say in June of 2007, and I spent my 23rd birthday in December in a hospital. My appendix ruptured, and so I had to go into emergency surgery, and it wasn't the best experience. I woke up on the table during the surgery, and I spent 6 days in the hospital, unable to get out of bed. I got an infection from my IV that they left in too long. So there was like a number of things that were really scary to me as a 23-year-old in a foreign country without my family or friends. And so even though I had signed a 2-year contract to play with them, once that experience happened, I came home and I kind of just decided it was time to hang up the shoes and move on, which was a hard decision for me because I loved getting paid to do something I had spent, a big chunk of my life doing.
Obviously that experience brings you back to America and unfortunately your athletic career comes to an end. So then walk me through the process of trying to find a job now that you're back home and going through all this recovery stuff. And what was that process like at 23, 24 years old?
So when I came back, I think my natural, progression was to go back to the GA, look for a place where I could coach, and then also, get my master's. And while I was applying for those things, I was working a job actually for Andrea Peterson's mom, who owned a bunch of daycares. And I was just working with kids as I was applying to jobs, probably for about, I want to say 3 months. And I had applied also in tandem with the GA positions to a slew of companies everywhere from Nike to Adidas to Yahoo at the time and AOL. And ESPN was the only place that called me back, which was really odd. The only email or response I got was from ESPN. And I think it was because I had a very untraditional background. And it was playing college sports, playing professionally, but then also being a design major, which, isn't that popular. I think even at Drexel, I was one of the first athletes to graduate through Westfall. At the time, there weren't a lot of athletes who were in the design or the arts school or program. And so that was a very unique thing for them to see on a resume. Oh, there's someone who absolutely is a diehard sports fan, but then also is applying for a job in creative services and wanting to be an art director at some point. And so I ended up taking the job instead of going back to school. And, it was the best decision I think I could have ever made.
Well, and, but shortly into that job experience, you then have another medical situation occur where you get diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And I had the chance to listen to one of your speeches for the Jimmy V Foundation. And you mentioned at 24, you didn't even know what a thyroid was. So take me back to that whole experience. I know it's obviously traumatic and tough to recall, but what was that like, having just overcome what you went through in Romania to then get hit with that diagnosis?
I mean, it was kind of surreal at the time, because not only was I in a year and a half in, I had started my master's at Full Sail University, and I was also coaching Division III basketball at the time. And I remember playing in this kind of like semi-pro pickup league on the side as well, where I just felt like I was working out all the time, but I would come into work and people would make fun of me. They were like, "Oh, Kira, you're out drinking all night," because my face would be swollen and I would be really tired when actually I went to bed at like 8 p.m. the evening before. And then it started to get really hard to work out. So I went to one of my doctors, and I was like explaining my symptoms, and the first thing he did, he was like, "I'm going to feel your neck." And I was like, okay, weird, whatever. But he did. And I had this huge nodule that when he pointed it out, I had never realized, which was crazy to think, that I had this like lump sticking out of my neck basically. And it was a really scary experience, having to go through the biopsy process. And I remember exactly where I was when I found out. But I think from a career standpoint, what was really scary for me is that I just landed this amazing job. Like, I was having so much fun in my career. I was so young. Romania was very traumatic. Out of all the health scares I've had, that was the most traumatic because of the experience of waking up on the table. But I also was like, oh my God, am I going to get fired? What is this going to do for my life? And there was never that moment where like thyroid cancer, like, thank God, is like one of the most curable. It just wasn't as common for someone as young as I was at that time. And I remember walking into our VP's office and having to tell him, like, I have cancer. I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know what this process looks like. And I will never forget, he shut his door. He like walked around the table. He sat down with me and we talked about it. And he was like, whatever you need. And he helped me through the whole process. He was so incredible. He called my dad weekly because I was on a short-term disability for surgery and treatment for like 4 months. And it couldn't have been a better process or a better company to be with at the time. I never felt like I was going to come back and be replaced. And as scary as it was, like, ESPN was culturally one of the best places to have had that type of experience and not worry about like coming back and still having a job.
Well, and I know music is such a big part of your life, obviously now working at Capitol Records, but heard a story in a podcast you talk about how listening to Michael Jackson and your dad played that, as you're going through treatment, and just music in general. How did that help you through that rough time period? And how would you suggest to other people how to use music to help them through periods of time in their life of difficulty?
So music had always been part of my story. I drowned myself in basketball when things were hard, but I also always had headphones on. I had very specific songs and rituals when I was in college that I had to listen to. And, it was something that I grew up doing with my dad, being part of Motown and listening to the oldies. And Michael Jackson was one of my first loves, is music, and why I love dance, which was what I was doing before I got into basketball. And so for the entire duration of my surgery, my dad on his little MP3 player listened to Michael Jackson and probably now knows every song and every lyric and every beat to a T. But it was something that really like resonated with me, and it was something that I shared with my dad, like, to know that he sat there the entire 4 or 5 hours that I was in surgery and just like thinking about me. And I can't imagine what that was like for him. So music has always like been this narrative, story driven. A lot of times I feel like it's words that, we all feel sometimes that don't really know how to say. And I really do believe that there are soundtracks to our lives. There are probably songs that you can think of, exactly where you were at the time. And now working in music, it's so more important to me now after sitting with these artists and understanding the writing process and where these songs come from, because a lot of these songs come from a place of experience and vulnerability, and it's part of their story. Where us as athletes, our story was in how hard we worked and the championships and the relationships that we kind of garnered along the way. But for these artists, it's how this music transcends and touches people they never knew possible.